Welcome to DeRosa Aquatic Consulting's first ever Facebook Live. Today we'll be talking about COVID-19 and aquatics. So please join me in welcoming me. Hi everyone, and welcome to my first ever Facebook Live. My name is Sean DeRosa, and I am with DeRosa Aquatic Consulting. And for those of you who are not familiar with my background and what it is that I'm doing, by training, I'm an attorney, but my passion is aquatics. And with DeRosa Aquatic Consulting, I help organizations like yours minimize risks and improve safety. So let me give you a little bit of a background as to why it is that I'm looking to do a Facebook Live now. It seems that we've all been watching Zoom meetings, and there have been some really good presentations on COVID-19 and aquatics. And people were saying, Sean, how come you're not doing one? How come you're not talking about some of the legal implications, some of the risk management concerns? And to be honest with you, we didn't have concrete information. So I was hoping that we would wait until CDC gave us some guidance and really gave us a better understanding of what it is that you will be dealing with when you're looking at opening up your pools and your beaches. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. Before I get started, of course, I have to do the obligatory disclaimer that all lawyers are going to do. You know what, I think that there is a major delay between the comments and between what's going on. So my apologies for the technical difficulties. For those of you that know me, here I am in Orlando, Florida, and it's just me trying to handle the technology and have the discussions. So let's go ahead and talk about the ground rules. Please keep in mind that today's presentation is for informational purposes only. While we may talk about legal issues and liability concerns, nothing that I say during this presentation should be construed as legal advice, particularly for those of you joining from the UAE, from Canada, or from other jurisdictions. If you do need legal advice, please contact competent counsel licensed to practice in your jurisdiction. Also, remember that what we know now about the coronavirus is evolving and guidance from CDC is ongoing, so information discussed may not constitute the most up-to-date science or legal information. Here's the agenda that we want to talk about today. Today, what we're going to look at will be questions concerning COVID-19. Predominantly, we're going to talk about what are the basic coronavirus facts that we're aware of. What are the guidelines and best practices that you should be following, and where are those sources? And what I'll also do when the video goes live is I have a document that will allow me to provide you links to organizations that have been really helpful. Thanks, Craig. I'm getting some tips in the side that if I split screen it works, so I guess I'm going to try that as well. So let's try a split screen just and we'll see. Here we go. All right, so split screen works. So this is what we're going to talk about then today. So guidelines and best practices, and we want to compare those guidelines and best practices to local orders because I'm hearing from many clients that they're hearing from their supervisors that they have concerns if there are no specific orders and we're being asked to work under best practices. We'll be talking about screenings and, of course, physical distancing. And we'll look at that from the perspective of the employee, from staff, and during training as well. We'll talk a little bit about risk reduction, waivers, and signages. And we'll look at some programmatic concerns. I have so many people asking about swimming lessons. And spoiler alert, I don't have the solution to that, but there have been some great webinars. I'll give you some thoughts, of course, and some concerns I have, but it's something that we're just going to all have to explore. Most certainly, we're going to talk about general liability concerns, and most importantly will be your questions. You know, a couple weeks back, Craig Sears had done a Facebook Live or a Zoom meeting, I forget which, where he just took questions and answered them. And you know what? It was one of the best presentations that I saw because it really was responsive to the questions that everyone had. So that's kind of the ground that we're going to cover today. So let's look at, as I try to figure out the technology here, let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about what we know about the coronavirus. So what do we know about the coronavirus? We know quite a lot, right? But at the same time, we sometimes think that we don't really know all that much. So there are some basic facts that we should think about. One of the basic facts is that the novel coronavirus, what we consider to be SARS-CoV-2, causes COVID-19 infection. And when things first started happening, the understanding was that this was spread via droplet transmission. Well, nowadays we have some concerns over whether or not droplet transmission is the only way that this infection is spread. It seems that there's more information coming out that there may be some degree or some concern for airborne transmission. And again, I'll find a way to get you all of these slides in a more readable format when this video actually posts. What we also seem to know is that indoor venues seem to be a higher risk than outdoor venues, and that the length of exposure matters. So the longer someone is exposed to the virus, the more likely it is that they'll inhale enough of the particles to cause infection. So length of exposure is an issue. There was a neat blog that I wrote. I can't talk about the medical veracity of the post. All I can say is that it was informative. So that it was entitled "The Risks, Know Them and Avoid Them." So if you saw my Twitter page, or when you watch this again, when I post it, you'll see the link to watch that down the road. So that's really what we seem to know about the virus. And what concerns me most is the recent concerns for airborne transmission, right? And that is something that I think we as operators need to be concerned with. So let's talk a little bit about guidelines and best practices. As you know, when we start looking at some of the guidelines and the best practices regarding COVID-19, we want to look at those organizations that have done some research or that have come out and given some sort of position statement relative to the virus. And I know you can't read all of these different groups that are out there, but there's quite a lot. What I would suggest is that the CDC guidance is super important. Now, understand that the Centers for Disease Control here in the United States, although it's a federal agency, it doesn't establish mandatory regulations. In other words, they provide information to the rest of the country, and it is up to each jurisdiction to determine how they're going to implement the guidance from the Centers for Disease Control. Now, I say that knowing that in the absence of a local rule, in the absence of a local code, the Center for Disease Control is given quite a lot of authority. In other words, people really trust the CDC, and they know that what they're putting out, or we've always felt that what they've been putting out, is science-based. So whether you're looking to the CDC as a starting point, whether or not in your local jurisdiction your governor has put forth a reopening plan that says you must comply with the CDC, I would suggest if you don't comply with the CDC and something happens, that's going to be an issue. So anytime that there is a national standard or guidelines from a professional association and you deviate from those standards, that's something that you might have to explain. So I like to tell everyone, just as a matter of like a good rule of thumb, if there's a policy from CDC, fine if you're able to implement that at your facility. Now, there are other organizations that have done some amazing work, including the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions. IAAPA had a reopening guidance that they put out. If you haven't read it, I suggest you download that. And there's a host of information available from OSHA as well regarding how to prepare workplaces for COVID-19. I encourage you to read OSHA. Now, for those of you in the US, you know that oftentimes public employers don't necessarily have to comply with federal OSHA guidelines. We're seeing now that every state or the states in general are adopting state OSHA or mimicking the federal guidelines. So for the most part, OSHA's a deal. You need to take a look at it. For those of us, I see some people, hey, from Canada. Also, the Life Saving Society in Canada has done an amazing job putting forth information. And if you haven't checked out the Royal Life Saving organization out of Australia, they also have some really cool information. So I'll make certain that you get all of these posts or all this link when it goes live. So when we move from guidelines or best practices that some of these organizations are putting forth, we have to think a little bit about the state orders. Now, we know that those state orders seem to be changing, and they vary greatly. So it is very important that as you're looking to open up your facility, you go ahead and work with your local health department and try to figure out how it is that they want you to operate. Those local authorities having jurisdiction becomes super important. So you have to comply with any local ordinance, any local codes. Yes, Craig, awesome. I should see if I can do this. So Craig Sears mentions that PHTA, the Pool and Hot Tub Alliance, has some very helpful operational guidelines. Awesome. Thank you for doing that. That's true. That'll also be on the document that I hope to share. Here is the link for those of you that want to go ahead and take a look at that later. Thanks, Craig, for doing that. Hello, Sarah from Las Vegas. So we're going back to state and local orders. Obviously, we have to follow our guidance. Now, consider many states are asking operators, whether they be at beaches or pools, to restrict capacity, and perhaps looking indoors or at an outdoor pool at maxing capacity at about 25% to 50% of what you would otherwise operate under. And the easiest way to do that, if you restrict parking, that's one helpful way to limit the people that come to your facility. So take a look to see what those local ordinances are. There may be signage that is required under your plan to reopen or through your local health department. You want to make certain that you're complying with that. And of course, the big question is face coverings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Sorry, talking all by myself. My voice is getting scratchy. Obviously, we need to look at tables and setting them apart. One of the things, and I'm not going into all the operational details, I'm really trying to focus on some of the risks, but why is it that I mentioned the tables in 12 feet or 3 meters apart? There's been a lot of discussion if people stand up from the table and the tables are only set 6 feet apart, then they're automatically too close to the next person. So consider spreading your tables out a little bit more. And the last thing I would suggest as we're looking at state and local orders, for example, face coverings, I question, do we have to be ordered to do something if it's the right thing to do? I don't have an answer to that, but I would suggest that if the CDC is recommending face coverings and in your local jurisdiction, it's not ordered, but in the national guidelines that we're seeing from virtually all of the lifeguard training organizations, they're saying face coverings are important. It seems that the best practice would be to have a face covering. And again, we'll talk about face coverings in a little bit. How are we doing? So far, so good? All right, so let's move on to health screenings. When you consider whether or not it's time to reopen, health screenings becomes important to think about. Screening at the entrance would be another way to look at it. Now, we'll talk about health screenings from the perspective of the customer, but also from the perspective of the employee. And I think it's important that we distinguish the two for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about those as we go. One of the most important things that I think you can do is place a sign in multiple places at the entrance that really encourages people to stay home if they have had any of the signs or symptoms or if they're feeling ill. Now, keep in mind, we already do this with respect to accidental fecal releases or diarrhea in the pool. People that have had diarrhea within the past 2 weeks, we have some concerns that perhaps they may have been infected by Cryptosporidium. So we're used to excluding people. Hey, way cool. We've got 41 people up with the Lifeguard Authority watch party. Thanks, Joey, for letting me know. That's awesome. Hello to all of you. So posting signs at the entrance, I think, is super important. If you're going to institute temperature checks, I think you need a plan to do that. Now, there's been some concern. Hey, Glenn, sorry, focus is a matter of internet connection. Sorry about that, man. If you're looking at doing temperature checks, there are a few things to think about. Today, when I went to get this fancy haircut, hopefully it looks good, I had to wear a face mask when I went to the barber. And when I walked in, they immediately took my temperature with an infrared thermometer. These things are relatively inexpensive. They're still somewhat available, although it was hard to find. They're touchless, so as long as you're about an inch away from the forehead, if you hold it, you get a reading. I'm at 99.1 degrees, which is good. It's a little warm in here right now. It's important that we understand that not everyone with COVID-19 infection will have a temperature. So although the use of the thermometer will give you an idea as to whether or not to suspect that they may or they may not have COVID-19, it really isn't absolute. So there is some concerns over whether that thermometer or that temperature reading would be valid. Also keep in mind, if your customers are in line, standing in the sun, if they've exerted themselves walking from the car to get to the entrance, that too might affect their temperature. So the general recommendations for temperatures are that they're taken in a controlled environment, which really means in an air-conditioned location. That may not be possible. So I would think if you're going to implement these for customers, and I don't think it's a bad idea, you do need to have a plan in place for what to do if someone fails that temperature screening, and also who in their party is excluded from access. Now, what I'm seeing is the best practice is to then take those persons in that party, if you have someone with an elevated temperature, and bring them to a shaded space, set them aside, let them cool down a little bit, and reattempt a temperature test. Also, some follow-up questionings as to whether or not they've had any symptoms might be helpful. So definitely think about that. It's most certainly something that you can do during a pandemic for customers. Now, as we move that discussion over to staff, there are a few concerns that you want to think about. Historically, temperatures have been considered a health screening under the Americans with Disabilities Act. With that, we know that any medical information that we get from employees, we have an obligation to protect. So one of the questions would be, who's going to take your the temperatures? So obviously, if you have medical staff, that would be great. And yes, there's a question as to what is the temperature. The temperature that most people seem to be using is 100.4 degrees. So thanks for sharing that as well. If you don't have medical staff, if you don't have an EMT, if you don't have a nurse, that's okay. You can use regular staff, in other words, people who are not medical professionals, but they're going to need a little bit of training. We can't just give them the thermometer and set them free. So as you're thinking about using lifeguards or non-medical staff, they need to be trained in the specific use for that specific device. So when you get the thermometer, read the instructions and see how it should be used. See how it should be decontaminated. Ideally, they're contactless. In other words, you don't have to touch the person, but they need to be trained in what to do if they accidentally do make contact with the person that they're screening. And generally, that's an alcohol swab with some dry time. There are recommendations I've seen that suggest that people wipe down that thermometer in between use and that they use the same alcohol pad as long as it's wet. I don't know if that's necessary if you're not making contact, but those are the things that you have to think about. Also, what PPE are you going to require the person screening temperature? Are you going to use a mask? And when I say a mask, I mean more like that N95 mask for that person's own protection. Are you asking that they wear goggles or perhaps a face shield for eye protection? And when we talk about eye protection later, we'll see that goggles protect the eyes, the face shield protects more from splatter. Wearing a face shield should always mean that you have your goggles on underneath them. And are you going to have them wearing a gown? Again, the concern here is if you're putting staff in a position where they may come into close contact, close enough to take someone's temperature, we want to give them the PPE that they need to do it safely. So give that some thought as well. Also, there are a few concerns over where you're taking employee temperatures. OSHA prefers that if someone will be sent home for medical reasons, that isn't public knowledge. So oftentimes we want to take employee temperatures out of line of sight of other employees. So something to think about, most certainly run that up through your risk management office, legal counsel as well, if you don't have a risk management office, but it's something to think about. And also, all these temperatures should be before they come onto the premises as well. The last point I want to make about screening temperature at the entrance is that this is current CD or OSHA guidance based upon the CDC recommendations, based upon the current status of the pandemic. As the pandemic evolves and perhaps the cases drop, infection rate drops, hospitalizations drop, it may be that we reach a point that screening has to be reconsidered. So I'm not suggesting that you look at screening from now moving forward without an end date. I'm thinking that perhaps as the pandemic changes and evolves and the threat is lowered, we may need to dial back the temperature screening. A question regarding sunglasses, great question, because I know a lot of people have, our guards have sunglasses. So as a general rule, sunglasses would not be considered adequate protection. We really want to take a look at not swim goggles, but a liquid, almost like a chemical protection mask that can seal around the face. That's really what they're looking at. And if you've seen videos of the COVID-19 drive-up centers, that type of PPE is really what I'm asking you to think about. So any questions on the temperature testing or the physical screening? I would say keep in mind with these health screenings that anything that you document, particularly with employees, then becomes part of their medical record. So that needs to be kept separate and apart from their standard employee file. So talk with your supervisors to find out what exactly they would like you to document with regard to physical screenings at the gate. Okay? All right, so let's move on to our next topic. And again, oh, here's a good question from Diane. How do we work with prescription goggles and prescription glasses and goggles? There are goggles or masks, I guess would be a better word, that can work over prescription glasses. It's very common in industry when there's eye protection needs or in like the chemical application. So those are available, but it most certainly is something to think about. So thanks, Diane, for that question. That was great. Sarah or Sahara is suggesting that perhaps not having someone with glasses do the testing. So, and that would be something to think about as well. You know, if they don't need glasses, that removes that concern. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about physical distancing requirements. So as we look at what we're going to do, let's see. Let me see if I can bring up that slide. Sorry about that, I lost it. Here we go. So physical distancing. Again, we want to take a look at this question from the perspective of customers, staff, and training. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can zoom in on this, and the audio will pause for a moment, I believe. Okay, so there's a little bit of information on physical distancing. From customer perspective, when we talk about physical or social distancing, what we're really talking about is keeping households together. In other words, a family unit or a household unit can be within close proximity at the pool or at the beach, because that's what it's like at home. People that are outside of that household unit, I'm trying not to say family because we have to keep in mind that families have many different shapes and sizes, and people that live together may not be necessarily a family. There could be roommates. So really it's a household, people that are living together. That's what we're really talking about. There still are recommendations that group sizes be limited. And again, this is an area where your local authority having jurisdiction will provide additional guidance. So how big is your gathering size? Many areas right now, group size is limited to 10. And what does that mean? That means no more than 10 people within one household should be in that close proximity to one another. They should stay at least 6 feet, about 2 meters away from anyone else that doesn't live in their household, and that's on the deck, on the sand, or in the water. Now, at beaches, that might need to be extended. I don't know if anyone was watching the news this morning, but there's some information coming in from Greece and some design concepts in Italy that will be showing different ways to rope off or in one design, plexiglass off locations on a beach for people to have a blanketing area, but also be separated from one another. That allows for a pathway of about 2 meters, about 6 feet in between those areas. I honestly don't know how likely we are to see that. Although I do think it's a good idea, it might take a little bit of effort. The other thing I'll say, particularly with beaches, I'm here in Florida, and as we've seen when the beaches open up, people aren't really great at this whole physical distancing thing. So enforcement of physical distancing is something that we need to think about. Now, the CDC has said that their recommendation is that lifeguards on the stand shouldn't be responsible for enforcement of physical distancing, face mask requirements, etc. And I agree with that. So when we look at enforcement, what we're really talking about is a supervisor at the pool, at the beach. In some cases, it may even be law enforcement that will be the one to gently encourage people to maintain those physical distancing requirements, particularly if those are orders coming from your local jurisdiction. Honestly, that's going to be a challenge for us. And I think that there has to be a plan within your jurisdiction to look at whether or not you might need to close a facility down if customers are not maintaining physical distance. Again, work with your local authority having jurisdiction to try to figure that out before it actually happens. Now, when we talk about physical distancing for customers, that's one thing, but really we all know that physical distancing of our staff is going to be a challenge as well. And what that includes would not only be staff areas such as a lifeguard room, a break room, or locker rooms or changing areas, but it also includes during rotations and maybe even on the lifeguard stand itself. If we're talking about a beach, it's common practice to have 2 guards up on, let's say, an ocean beach where they have a large swath of land to watch and water to watch. Perhaps not the same at an inland lake or a pond where it's more common to have perhaps only 1 guard in that stand. But even at lifeguard stands, there are recommendations during that rotation to allow that 6 feet of distance and to perhaps look at cleaning the guard stand as part of that rotation so that the person coming in isn't coming into contact with anything that the person going out has touched. There are also recommendations, of course, to have hand sanitizer at the stations as well. And during training, and I think this is an important concept, that even though we're opening up facilities at some point when you're allowed to do so, during training, staff still need to maintain physical distance with one exception. And that exception being skills where they can't maintain physical distance. For example, you can't do a rescue in the water without coming into contact with that person. We can do an extension assist, right? But if we're talking your standard go in, grab them and pull them out sort of rescue, active, passive, what have you, they need to have that practice. So they're going to need to maintain their skill proficiency. Team CPR, pit crew CPR. Again, that is something that they're going to need to practice. So in those cases where it's on land, consider whether or not for the land-based skills, you can follow the recommendations from your training agency for facial coverings. But in the water, they're not going to have their facial covering on. And that is a risk. And again, that's part of doing the job. Much like every time a lifeguard goes in the water to make a rescue, they are putting their life in jeopardy. And really, this is no different. We've always dealt with unknowns in the lifeguarding world. It's always been information about tuberculosis and other diseases that they may come into contact with. This is really no different. So there's a question in terms of where this guidance is coming from. Shelby, that guidance is coming from different training organizations. So for example, Ellis and Associates put out a document with how you could modify your lifeguarding classes to meet those standards. Stargard Elite has put out information regarding how to do training. But the bottom line is that if you need to open, the standard of care is that lifeguards are competent at doing emergency action plan based rescues from the moment they get in the stand. And the only way they can do that is through practice. Also keep in mind that in some states, training of lifeguards is specifically being authorized by either a governor order or an authority having jurisdiction. In other words, the health department. So really working in advance to include that language with your health department, I think is super important. Whitney has an excellent comment that I'm gonna put up on the screen for everyone to see as well. Locker rooms are an issue with social distancing, and I agree. Particularly indoors, and ventilation, I think, is something to think about as well. So monitoring people going in and coming out, that's a really wise thing to do. So kudos for that as well. The other thing to think about when we're looking at training is whether or not mannequins can be used. So that mannequin, a little bit more on the pricey side for some organizations, but it is something to consider that you could incorporate in your training programs. They actually work. When I used to teach up at Salem State, we had, I think it was called a Rescue Randy, and that was something that we used. It worked. All right, let's talk a little bit about personal protective equipment. So PPE. Question for, before I get there, Gary. Hey, Gary. Asked a good question about keeping locker rooms closed and complying with the bather code. You know, that's a good question. I'm more concerned about people actually having a place to go to the bathroom. So closing down the locker room entirely might not be something that I would recommend, but controlling access and limiting the number of people going in, I think might be wise. There are places that are also having staff go in and clean. And we'll talk a little bit about cleaning. The standard is clean frequently, and then frequently seems to be defined as once a day, which I don't think is all that frequently. So I would say you're right, Gary, closing down the locker room if you don't have a bathroom option, particularly where you're a public swimming pool, would be not recommended. There might be some guidance for those pools that are not necessarily considered public, but semi-public. But again, that's a good point to consider. And Jackie has a great idea as well, borrowing a few of these life-size mannequins from the fire department. That's great. Pull those resources together. Thanks, Jackie, for sharing that. So PPE, personal protective equipment. What is it that they're going to need? So this year, I think we're going to have to really consider what we're doing in terms of PPE. The recommendation for customers are that they wear face coverings, and those may or may not be required by your local orders. But for staff, it seems to be the best practice is that face coverings should be used at all times. That's consistent with the CDC. In terms of resuscitation, there's a recommendation that we consider a viral filter for the bag valve mask resuscitator. It's a little piece that attaches in between the mask and the bag. It's basically a fabric filter. I would recommend that you go ahead and take a look at buying some of those. That little piece is not very expensive at all. I've had a lot of customers or clients call and ask about N95s, and I think it's important that we focus in on this N95 question, because N95s are for the protection of the wearer. Those are considered respiratory protection devices. So we want to make certain that if we're providing N95 masks, that we're complying with the OSHA respiratory protection standard, which would require fit testing. And again, goggles for resuscitation, and I'm not talking about swim goggles. Craig has a good comment here as well about wanting patrons to shower. Yes, I think showers are great. At the same time, there are plenty of facilities where people aren't showering. So yes, we want them to shower, but I'm not as concerned about that on my side. It might make me go through a little bit more chlorine. I might have to close early if my chemistry can't keep up with the need, but I think the shower itself, from just my personal perspective, is not the key issue for me. Go ahead and jump in if you're sweaty and gross. The chlorine hopefully will deal with it. But you're right. A good comment from Andy on deck showers for rinsing. That's also a good idea. So PPE, make certain that you're looking at those viral filters for your bag valve mask. That's a pet peeve of mine as well. For those of you who are operating without a bag valve mask, spend the $20, buy a BVM, right? Nowadays, we don't want to be using face masks to provide resuscitation ongoing. Sure, we might use them in the water. Sure, we might use them until the BVM gets there. But for $20, you can provide more oxygen to someone in need than perhaps with just breathing out your own air. So go ahead and take a look at BVMs if you don't have them. All right, so let's see how we're doing. Let's talk a little bit about the face coverings. So face coverings, let me see if I can find that slide. We'll hide this one. And we'll bring this one up. So face coverings really show your desire to protect others, right? Excuse me. So they're recommended by the CDC for everyone that's not in the water. And really, we're looking at reusable cloth face coverings. Ideally, they should be double-lined. There are some that are poly-lycra blend. They hold shape. They're water-resistant. Essentially, they're made out of bathing suit material. And I would suggest they can be used as a resale option. Shout out to Original Watermen. They were kind enough to rush me out this mask. I don't know how the audio will be. I'll move in a little bit closer and I'll adjust my glasses. So this, you can see, can stay on. I can talk through it. I can breathe through it. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. It's fairly comfortable. And what I like about these is that because they're bathing suit material, they can get wet and they dry fairly easily. I will say I have not gone into the pool yet wearing this. I know you're not supposed to swim with them. I get that, but I wanted to test it. What I did do was immerse it in water, get it completely soaking wet, and try to breathe through it, and I could. So someone wants me to go ahead and put this screen full screen, so I'm gonna pause my audio, and I'm going to maximize this screen for a moment, and then I'll come back. Awesome, thanks for that. Nicole, at the playback, if you need to see more of that, you'll have that screen, and of course, I'll post these slides somehow, if I can do that on Facebook, which I think I can. If I can't, send me an email, and I'll figure it out for you. So whether you're using a gaiter, whether or not you're using a face covering, I'm trying not to say face mask for these, that's something to think about. I strongly recommend them. Paper disposable masks, I wouldn't recommend. Aside from the fact that they can come apart, the cleanup can be an issue, but really the cloth is really what I recommend. And the reason why I really like the bathing suit material, and there are other companies that sell these, so I'm not promoting one version over the next, but the reason why I like them is that they are bathing suit material and they can get wet. So if you're teaching swimming lessons, this might be something that your staff could wear while they're standing in the water. Clearly, you're not going to swim with it underwater, but yes, when you're holding this to your mouth, if it's wet, you can breathe through it. I don't know from personal experience having swam with it. I haven't done that, of course, but it's doable. Not swimming, breathing through it. So questions on that? So let's talk a little bit about waivers and signage. I think that's something that people are really interested in, and we had some questions in advance. And there was a question, if I could share that link, I will do that in a moment. And actually someone has it posted in the comments, so someone's done that for me. So as we look at waivers and signage, one of the things that we want to consider is what information are we going to give the public? Now, shout out to Redwood's group. This information is taken from their website. The link, I know you can't read it since I'm in the split screen, but again, if you Google redwoodsgroup.com, they have a whole section on COVID-19 response. They've got sample waivers for adults, sample waivers for minors. They've got sample signage. Most certainly, if you're going to implement any of these waivers or signage requirements, run that through legal counsel. Don't just take what you find online, any website, and just use it. You need to run that up the chain of command, if you will. But at least it's something to do. So let's talk a little bit about what a waiver does and what a sign does. A sign provides notice. It tells people, hey, there's a pandemic going on. You could get sick here. There's no guarantees. That sign works for employees as well as the public. A waiver is a little bit different. A waiver, particularly for program participation, says, hey, we have a known risk, such as COVID-19. There's a pandemic going on. We can't guarantee your safety. Therefore, if you participate, understand that you might get sick. Will it hold up in court? Who knows, right? Some states say waivers are against public policy. Other states say waivers for an adult are acceptable. They look more carefully at waivers for minors. These are all things that your attorney will sort through. So that's why I say have a discussion with your lawyer about this. But most certainly, I recommend signage and waivers only because it helps put people on notice. So I think they're a good thing. Questions on waivers at all? There being none. So let's talk about ever so briefly, and then I want to save some time for questions and answers. You guys are doing a great job, by the way, answering your own questions in the chat and the comments. So I've only pulled a few in, but you guys are doing great. You're really reading and staying up on top of some of these issues, so kudos for that. So let's talk a little bit about liability concerns. One of the questions that I get a lot is, well, you know, what happens if a staff member gets COVID-19? What happens if a patron gets COVID-19, you know, after coming to my pool? And I would say, well, gosh, that risk is present. We can't guarantee their safety. The law doesn't require us to guarantee safety, but it does require that we be reasonable. right? The risk of infection, we know, can be reduced by implementing certain best practices. So wearing face masks at all times becomes super important. Nicole asks, here's a good question, I'll show this as well. Should a COVID waiver be in addition to our regular participation waiver? Nicole, I think that's a great idea. If there are specific high risk concerns that you have, separating them out most certainly helps, although it may not be required. But again, I would run that up through your lawyer as well. If you are going to be sued from an employee, that lawsuit will most likely fall under a workers' compensation claim. There are certain employees have the ability, for example, minors in some states might be able to sue through the court system before they go through a workers' compensation claim. But the key issue in all of these will be, how did that person get COVID-19? And it will be very difficult for a plaintiff to demonstrate in the middle of a pandemic that the only way they got COVID-19 infection was coming to your pool or going to your beach. There are literally hundreds of other opportunities for them to be exposed to a virus every time they step out the door. So being able to pinpoint your facility as being causal to the infection is going to be a high burden for them to overcome. Now, if your pool becomes the next meat packing plant, well, then, yeah, you might have a problem. What I mean by that is if all of your employees become exposed and everyone gets ill, well, then, yes, that's going to be a problem, right? Because it allows the inference that something happened at work to allow for transmission. So that's why enforcing physical distancing, enforcing face mask or facial covering use is so important. Also recommend looking at phases or teams, like an A team, a B team, a C team, depending upon the size of your staff, and ensuring that those teams don't interact. So if 5 lifeguards are assigned a shift, those 5 work. When they leave, another 5 come in. It's not your typical rotation where 1 comes in, 1 goes out. We don't want those teams to interact with each other. The other thing to think about is during training, when you're setting up your in-service training or your programs for lifeguard training, when you assign paired practice in the water for a rescue skill, let's say you assign 2 students to be partners, they're partners for the entirety of that session. In other words, we're not asking them to rotate through all the victims like we might normally do. We're asking to limit exposure by pairing those partners up for in-water work. That way, if one partner is pre-symptomatic, later we find out that they came to the training and they were infected. At best, they came into close contact with that one partner, not the rest of the team, because you would have had physical separation between the rest of them. Okay. Colleen's putting up some information from the NRPA. Also, they have some good information and some really good social media shareable icons or infographics with NRPA, so be certain to check those out as well. So again, I don't think from a practical standpoint we have much to be concerned from a liability perspective. Know that if you are a public entity, there are other legal defenses that help public employers out that private employers don't get. Sarah or Sahara shared that any document requiring a signature from a minor should include a parent's signature. I agree, minors really can't sign things for themselves. So if you're asking a child to sign something, really we want to be asking the parent to sign on that child's behalf. So great comment there as well. So don't freak out about the liability, but make certain that you are implementing the OSHA recommendations, the CDC recommendations, because that's your primary line of defense, right? Under OSHA requirements, employers have a general duty to protect employees against potentially life-threatening serious injury or illness. And coronavirus COVID-19 infection could fall within both serious illness and life-threatening. So we have to do something, but we don't have to guarantee safety. We're going to do the best that we can under the circumstances, but most certainly we have to train our staff, and that means there will be occasions where they will not be physically distant from one another. Okay. questions on that at all? So we're about 56 minutes in. That took a little bit longer, in part because some of the technology problems we had going on. But if there are questions that people have, I'm going to scroll through the comments and see if I missed any. Excuse me, but go ahead, and if you have a question, go ahead and type that in, and I want to make certain that I'm hitting your questions, your concerns. I am seeing questions on cleaning and what the best practice is for cleaning. Let me add in that if you are saying that you're going to clean the restrooms or touch points every hour, gosh, you need to make certain that you do that. So if the CDC is stating that frequent cleaning is needed, then you need to define what that is for your facility. They say every day at a minimum. I would suggest more frequently than that. There's also a comment or a question on waivers for specific events. I'm going to show Craig's question because I think this is interesting. Are waivers only effective for participation in specific events, or would it be beneficial for residents of an HOA to sign a waiver before being issued the pool key fob for the season? So that's a good question. Again, I would say that one's super fact specific. So obviously contact an attorney licensed to practice in your state for that answer. But I don't think it's a bad idea to have a waiver for when they're attending pool use. So for example, if you're selling a summer pass, a summer fob that they need to pick up, go ahead and sign an acknowledgement form of the risks of COVID-19 and maybe a standard waiver. In terms of events, I don't know that we're at a point where we're ready to be doing events, where we're ready to be doing swim meets and the like. So I would say for now, I would really caution you to consider the whole gathering size, if that's what you meant for events. But most certainly, swimming lessons, programmatic things would be valid too. Also, Julene, thanks for sharing. I forgot to mention, at least on the webinar, that AOAP, the Association of Aquatic Professionals, has a whole page of COVID-19 resources with free webinars and information, so be sure to check them out for more information there. Scott has a great question on recommendations on contact tracing. This is a really interesting question, right? Because from a public health standpoint, contact tracing is important. I don't know that that is a requirement for our facilities. However, I do think that we need to have plans in place with respect to employees, schedules and shifts, so that we can determine if an employee has been exposed, then we need to see who they're working with. So we should be able to do that. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for, let's say, a water park where they might have hundreds of people coming in. There may be technologies in use where you could find who's present, but knowing without cameras who exactly came within 6 feet of someone else might be a little bit of a challenge. So there was a question, and I know we've talked about this, and I'll try to handle one more because I'm approaching the hour. There's a question here on N95s and aerosol generating procedures. So yeah, I do have some thoughts on that, Dan. And if you read some of the recommendations, they do allow for non-N95s. Remember, to wear the N95, you have to be in a respiratory protection program. There has to be specific fit testing. And by fit testing, I don't mean put it to your face, breathe in, blow out, and see if it bubbles. They actually put a hood over you and they measure airflow. So it's very specific. And the goal of a fit test is determine which type of N95 best fits your face. So it's not one N95 works for everyone. So, I'm telling everyone, if you want to keep some N95s there, great, but just understand that if it's not part of a respiratory protection program, there's a red flag going up. And if staff don't know how to use it properly and aren't trained, there's some question as to whether or not it will even be effective. We did have a question with regard to returning to work, particularly from minors. I know that Justin, Dr. Semsrott mentioned that on, I think, a Stargard Elite program the other day in terms of employee return to work. I think CDC has now said 10 days without symptoms and without medication. I think that would be something to look at. But of course, we have some concerns over requiring medical notes during a pandemic. So I don't know that we want to go down the medical note from a doctor route. But I would follow the current guidance. So with that, it's now 4 o'clock. We're exactly at 1 hour. Gosh, thank you guys so much for being so understanding with some of these technology challenges. And for my first ever Facebook Live, this has been super cool. Shoot me an email. Let me see if I have contacts that I can share with you. Here's my contact information, Sean at DeRosa Aquatics. I'll go ahead and I'll send you this PDF of the slides if that's helpful for you. There's my phone number. You can give me a call. I'll see what I can do to upload to the Facebook page. I don't know if that's really an option with Facebook, but I'll give it my best. So with that, thank you all so much, and we'll see you soon. Take care.